Elijah Carter stepped out of the courthouse, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the marble steps. The weight of his latest victory still clung to him. But there was no time to celebrate. The ink on the conviction of Dominic Russo, the notorious crime syndicate boss, was barely dry when his superior handed him a new case file, one that felt different the moment he opened it. Inside, the black and white mugshot of Marcus Avery stared back at him. A young black man, no older than 25, with tired eyes that carried the weight of someone who had already lost too much. The charges? Embezzlement of nearly $500,000 from a prominent real estate firm. The evidence was compelling: financial records, wire transfers, witness testimony. On paper, it seemed like an open and shut case. But as Elijah read further, a gnawing feeling settled in his gut. Something didn't add up. Avery had no prior record, no history of financial instability. Yet, the prosecution's narrative painted him as a criminal mastermind, carefully orchestrating a scheme that didn't fit his profile. Elijah shut the file and exhaled. If there was anything his years as a federal prosecutor had taught him, it was that cases like these, ones that felt too neat, too conveniently packaged, had a way of unraveling in the most unexpected ways. The following morning, Elijah arrived at the courthouse early, eager to meet the judge assigned to the case. Judge Walter Grayson was an old name in legal circles, a fixture in the system for over 30 years. Respected, feared, and, according to quiet whispers, a man who carried biases like an old family heirloom. Elijah entered the courtroom just as Grayson took his seat. The moment their eyes met, the disdain was palpable. It wasn't overt, not the kind of prejudice that would make headlines, but it was there, in the slight curl of Grayson's lips, the dismissive glance, the way he barely acknowledged Elijah's presence. "Ah, Mr. Carter," Grayson said, adjusting his glasses. "You're the prosecutor on this case, I assume?" "Yes, Your Honor." Grayson hummed, flipping through the case file. "Interesting choice. Assigning you to this. Let's hope your enthusiasm doesn't get in the way of objectivity." Elijah clenched his jaw. He had faced subtle racism before, backhanded comments, veiled skepticism about his qualifications, but hearing it from the judge who would oversee his case sent a chill down his spine. The pre-trial motions began, and the bias became increasingly evident. Every argument Elijah made was met with scrutiny, his objections overruled without reason, while the defense, headed by Martin Holloway, a seasoned attorney with deep political connections, received leniency. When Elijah tried to present additional financial records that cast doubt on Avery's alleged guilt, Grayson shut him down immediately. "This is irrelevant," the judge declared, barely glancing at the documents. "I see no reason to entertain wild theories." Elijah wanted to argue, to demand Grayson explain how exonerating evidence could be considered irrelevant, but he forced himself to stay calm. He needed to be strategic. After the hearing, Elijah met with his team in his office, his frustration barely contained. "I've never seen a judge so openly undermine a prosecutor," said David Lynn, his closest colleague. "It's like he's setting you up to fail." Sophia Morales, an investigative journalist Elijah had worked with in the past, leaned forward, her sharp eyes filled with curiosity. "Have you looked into Grayson's record?" Elijah shook his head. "Not yet. But after today, I'm starting to think I should." Sophia smirked. "Good. Because I already did." She tossed a folder onto his desk. Elijah flipped it open, scanning the contents. Case after case, year after year. A pattern emerged: Grayson's rulings disproportionately favored white defendants while harshly penalizing black and minority individuals. The statistics weren't just concerning. They were damning. He exhaled sharply. "This isn't just bias. This is systemic." Sophia nodded. "And if he's this blatant in your case, imagine how many others he's quietly buried." Elijah's mind raced. He had a job to do, to prosecute Marcus Avery fairly, but how could he do that in a courtroom where the scales of justice were already tipped against him? The answer was clear. He couldn't just fight the case. He had to fight the system itself. But that battle would come at a cost. As the night stretched on, Elijah sat alone in his office, staring at the flickering city lights outside. The path ahead was treacherous. He knew that challenging a sitting judge, especially one as powerful as Grayson, could cost him everything. His career. His reputation. Maybe more. And yet, as he thought of Marcus Avery, of the countless others who had been victims of this quiet, insidious injustice, he knew he had no choice. The real trial wasn't just about Marcus Avery. It was about exposing the truth, no matter the cost. The first punch landed before Elijah even entered the courtroom. That morning, as he walked into his office, his assistant, Nadia, was already waiting, her expression tight with concern. "You've been reassigned to a different case," she said, holding up an official-looking document. Elijah frowned and took the paper. It was a directive from the district attorney's office, an order removing him from the prosecution of Marcus Avery's case. "On what grounds?" he asked, scanning the page. "They didn't say," Nadia admitted. "But I heard whispers. Apparently, Judge Grayson filed a complaint. Something about unprofessional conduct and disruptive legal strategies." Elijah let out a bitter laugh. Unbelievable. This wasn't just retaliation. It was a warning. But the problem with warnings was that they only worked if you were afraid. Elijah wasn't. That night, Elijah met Sophia in a dimly lit bar downtown. The kind of place where conversations were drowned out by the hum of jazz and the clink of whiskey glasses. She slid a USB drive across the table. "You were right," she said. "Grayson isn't just biased, he's corrupt." Elijah plugged the drive into his laptop and clicked open the files. Bank records. Offshore accounts. Correspondences between Grayson and high-profile defense attorneys, some of whom had deep ties to the very firms where Marcus Avery was accused of embezzling funds. "This doesn't just prove bias," Elijah murmured. "This proves criminal activity." Sophia nodded. "It gets worse. You know Holloway, Avery's defense attorney?" Elijah clenched his jaw. "Yeah. He's been funneling money into Grayson's accounts for years," Sophia said. "In return, Grayson ensures his clients walk free." Elijah leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. This wasn't just about Marcus Avery anymore. This was about every single person who had ever stood trial in Grayson's courtroom. "So what's our next move?" Sophia asked. Elijah stared at the files, feeling the weight of them settle on his shoulders. "We expose him," he said. The next morning, Elijah stormed into the district attorney's office, demanding a meeting with his superior. "You took me off the case because of a complaint from Grayson?" he asked, barely containing his anger. "Have you seen his record? Do you know how many convictions he's manipulated?" DA Richard Calloway, a balding man with a permanent scowl, sighed and leaned back in his chair. "I'm not saying I don't believe you, Elijah. I'm saying you don't have enough to take him down." Elijah slammed a thick folder onto the desk. "I have plenty." Calloway hesitated before flipping through the documents. His scowl deepened. "This is serious." "Exactly." Calloway sighed. "You realize what you're doing, don't you? You're making an enemy of a sitting judge. Someone with enough political clout to bury your career." Elijah met his gaze, unwavering. "I'm not worried about my career. I'm worried about the people he's destroyed." Calloway exhaled through his nose. "I'll look into it," he said. "But I need more." "More?" Elijah left the office knowing that more meant evidence so overwhelming, so undeniable, that Grayson couldn't squirm his way out of it. The closer Elijah got to the truth, the harder the system pushed back. His office was broken into, files scattered, drawers ransacked. His laptop wiped clean. Sophia's car was tailed by an unmarked black sedan for 2 days straight. Even Marcus Avery, still behind bars awaiting trial, was transferred to a maximum security facility without explanation. Then came the phone call. Elijah was alone in his apartment when his phone rang. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A deep voice spoke on the other end. "Drop the case, Carter." Elijah's fingers tightened around the phone. "And if I don't?" A pause. Then, chillingly soft, "You won't like what happens next." Click. Elijah stood in his darkened apartment, heart pounding. They were scared. Good. Because that meant he was close. Elijah met Sophia the next day with a new plan. "We can't just expose Grayson in the press," he said. "We need to force his hand in court." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "And how do you plan to do that?" Elijah's expression was grim but determined. "I'm getting back on the Marcus Avery case. And this time, I'm making sure the whole world is watching." Elijah Carter wasn't just walking into a courtroom that morning. He was stepping onto a battlefield. By the time he arrived, the media frenzy had already begun. Cameras flashed as he strode up the courthouse steps, reporters shouting his name, demanding a statement. The whispers had spread, Judge Grayson's record, his questionable rulings, the sudden removal of Elijah from Marcus Avery's case. And now, Elijah was back. Thanks to pressure from D.A. Calloway, who finally realized the political firestorm that was brewing, Elijah had been reinstated as prosecutor. But this wasn't just about Marcus Avery anymore. This was about the entire system. Elijah adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and pushed open the courtroom doors. All eyes turned to him. And at the center of it all, sitting high on the bench, was Judge Walter Grayson. For the first time, Grayson looked unsettled. Elijah knew he had one shot. One moment to tip the scales. From the very start, he played it carefully. He argued his case with precision, every objection measured, every word deliberate. The goal wasn't just to win, it was to lay a trap. Grayson, predictably, ruled against him at every turn. Overruled objections. Shut down lines of questioning. Allowed Holloway, the defense attorney, free rein while Elijah was forced to fight for every inch. And then, Elijah sprung the first trap. He called a surprise witness. William Carter. A former defense attorney who had worked closely with Holloway. A man who had, until recently, been part of the very machine Elijah was fighting against. As William took the stand, Holloway immediately objected. Irrelevant witness. Elijah turned to Grayson, waiting. For a long, tense moment, the judge hesitated. The wrong call would look suspicious. Overruled, Grayson finally muttered. Elijah hid his smile. He had just forced Grayson into a corner. William Carter spoke carefully at first. Answered routine questions. Nothing groundbreaking. And then Elijah asked, "Mr. Carter, you aware of any unethical dealings between Judge Grayson and defense attorneys?" The room fell silent. Holloway shot to his feet. Objection. Grayson's voice was sharp. Sustained. "Move on, Mr. Carter." Elijah ignored them both. He turned back to William. "Do you have evidence?" Another beat of silence. Then, slowly, William reached into his coat pocket. Pulled out a USB drive. "My client has records of financial transactions, emails, and case manipulations directly involving Judge Grayson," Elijah declared. "And I'm submitting them into evidence." Grayson's face blanched. Objection. Holloway roared. "This is outrageous." But this time, the courtroom wasn't on their side. Murmurs spread. Reporters scrambled. The jury looked unsettled. Elijah had just turned the trial into a trial of its own. Judge Grayson slammed his gavel. "This is highly inappropriate. We are here to discuss the charges against Marcus Avery, not baseless accusations against the court." Elijah turned to face him directly. "With all due respect, Your Honor." If this evidence proves that this court has been compromised, then every case you've presided over, including this one, is in question. For the first time, Grayson had no words. Elijah knew what came next. The press would descend like vultures. The ethics committee would be forced to launch an investigation. And every single person Grayson had ever ruled against would demand justice. And just like that, his reign was over. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The next day, as the trial continued, Elijah gave his final statement. He didn't just talk about Marcus Avery. He talked about justice. About fairness. About the quiet, insidious ways the system was rigged. This case is about more than one man, Elijah told the jury. It's about what we allow to happen in our courts. It's about the people who were never given a fair trial because the system decided their fate before they even spoke. He turned, locking eyes with each juror. You have a choice today. To let things stay the way they are. Or to finally say, enough. Silence. Then, the jury filed out to deliberate. Hours passed. Then the jury returned. Elijah held his breath. The foreman stood. In the case of the United States versus Marcus Avery, we find the defendant not guilty. Relief crashed over Elijah. Marcus Avery sat frozen for a moment, then his face crumpled. Tears streaking down his cheeks as the weight of his ordeal finally lifted. Elijah looked over at Judge Grayson. For the first time, the judge looked small. Powerless. Defeated. Elijah had done it. He had won. But the real fight was just beginning. The moment the verdict was read, the courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed to the front. Cameras flashing as Marcus Avery collapsed into his mother's arms, sobbing with relief. The public defenders cheered. The prosecution team exchanged stunned glances. And Elijah Carter? He simply exhaled. Not because he had won. But because, for the first time in his career, justice had actually been served. But the battle was far from over. Judge Walter Grayson sat motionless on the bench, his face pale and unreadable. For decades, he had ruled his courtroom with unchecked power, deciding the fates of thousands. And now, for the first time, his own fate was no longer in his hands. Elijah met his gaze. Grayson looked away first. By the time Elijah left the courthouse that evening, the news had already broken. Federal judge under investigation for corruption. Elijah Carter's stunning courtroom victory exposes systemic bias. How many cases did Grayson rig? Sophia Morales' article was the final blow. She had published everything. The secret bank accounts. The backdoor deals with defense attorneys. The buried cases where Grayson had destroyed innocent lives. The fallout was immediate. That night, federal investigators swarmed Grayson's office, confiscating records. An emergency ethics review was launched. By morning, the Department of Justice announced a full-scale probe into every case he had ever ruled on. Elijah watched it all unfold from his apartment, the news blaring in the background. Then, his phone rang. Carter. It was DA Richard Calloway. His voice was unreadable. You should turn on the live broadcast. Elijah picked up the remote and flipped the channel. There, standing on the courthouse steps, was Judge Walter Grayson. He looked hollow. Older. Smaller. A man who had spent his entire life untouchable, now facing the consequences of his own corruption. The cameras flashed as he spoke. His voice shaking. I am stepping down from my position effective immediately. I will cooperate fully with the investigation. Elijah sat back. It was over. The days that followed were chaotic. Grayson wasn't just disgraced, he was indicted. Charged with obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and bribery. Every lawyer who had colluded with him was facing scrutiny. Cases were being reopened. Convictions overturned. And Elijah? He became the face of a movement. People called him a hero. A whistleblower. A man who had exposed the rot inside the justice system. But heroes paid a price. 2 weeks after the trial, Elijah was called into the DA's office. Richard Calloway leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "You know this isn't over, right?" Elijah nodded. "I know. You took down a sitting federal judge. There are people who want you gone for this." Elijah had already expected this. He had received the death threats, the anonymous letters, the veiled warnings from people in power. "So what happens now?" he asked. Calloway sighed. "They want you to step down." Elijah stared at him. "Are you firing me?" "No. But I'm telling you. The pressure from above is insane. If you stay, your life will be hell." Elijah thought about it. He had sacrificed everything for this case, his career, his safety, his peace of mind. He could leave. Walk away. Take the easy way out. Or he could do what he had always done. Keep fighting. Elijah stood outside the courthouse, staring up at the massive pillars. The very place where he had torn down a king. Sophia Morales appeared beside him. "So? What's next for Elijah Carter?" Elijah smirked. "I'm not going anywhere." She chuckled. "You really gonna take on the whole damn system, huh?" "Someone has to." She studied him for a moment, then held up her phone. "Good. Because I just got word, Congress is considering launching a federal investigation into judicial misconduct. Your case started something bigger." Elijah smiled. For the first time, it felt like change was actually possible. Grayson was gone. The system had been cracked open. But Elijah knew the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. And he was ready.